He balanced trays for a living. That night, he held something far more fragile than plates, a moment that would change two people who thought the world had already decided their parts. Eli moved through the restaurant like a practiced roomer, noticed briefly, then forgotten. His uniform was the color of late shift hours, a black apron that had seen better tips and worse nights. On the outside, he was careful and unremarkable. Steady hands, polite nods, the polite distance of someone who has learned to keep his personal weather under a lid. Inside, there was a map of small urgencies, phone calls he couldn't miss, an unpaid bill with an envelope folded down to the last dollar, a photo tucked into his wallet that he looked at 3 times before closing his hand around a pen. The restaurant was the kind of place that's never really closed. Low brass lamps, a constant hush of conversation, the kitchen's clang like punctuation. It was near midnight, and the clientele had narrowed from noisy dinner parties to a scatter of single tables and couples nursing the end of their evenings. The hum of the air conditioner and the clink of glasses made a soft soundtrack that let most people believe nothing abrupt could appear.
Nobody in the room moved to intervene. Their civility felt like a thin glass between action and consequence. Eli felt his pulse sharpen in his throat, not the loud betraying thump of sudden fear, but a tightening that knotted around a reason. He thought of home, a small apartment a block from the clinic, the pale frame drawing taped crooked to the fridge, his son's big blue scribble of a stick-figure family with a sun that looked like it might dissolve if touched. That boy, Jonah, was a patient at the hospital that had become a second address for Eli. Phlebotomy appointments, nights waiting in the glow of plastic chairs, the smell of disinfectant that never quite left his clothes. The last time he had missed a shift, he'd had to ask friends for help with rent. The exhausting ledger of every unpaid bill had taught him to move like someone who could not afford mistakes. He had learned courage in small doses, sitting through nights when machines hum louder than voice, learning to nod and let professionals carry the heavier words. But courage is not always something you earn. Sometimes it arrives like a choice. He had one reason to walk away, one reason he could imagine doing nothing, and one reason he couldn't: Jonah. Eli crossed the floor with the practiced gait of a man trained to be useful without being noticed. He kept his shoulders low, gave the manager the smallest of nods, the universal sign that a server was taking care of their section. His hands were steady as he placed a dish at a neighboring table. Each step was measured, the kind of control that comes from years of avoiding unnecessary flashes. He did not think of heroics. He only knew that the room was a place where the hurt could become worse if left alone, and there were people, tiny, stubborn truths, who needed someone to be present. He arrived beside the booth as the man's tone went low and sharp. The woman's fingers tightened on the tablet, her mouth pressed thin. The man's hand moved from the chair to the woman's shoulder, too close to the line that separates pushing from taking. Eli's voice, quiet, even, cut between them. "Excuse me, sir, can I get you anything else?" It was a server's question, but carried with it an unspoken boundary. The man's eyes slid to Eli, and for a second the room smelled like ozone, an electric expectation that something might break. The man slurred a smile. "Mind your own," he said, and tipped toward the woman in a way that tried to make the space smaller, the world more his. Eli's words stayed controlled. "We have to keep the dining area comfortable for everyone. If you'd like, I can move you to the bar." It was an offer to de-escalate, a practiced option that workers use to redirect conflict, a small, real tower to rearrange a situation. The man scoffed and leaned forward. The woman turned her head slightly, avoiding their eyes. The rest of the restaurant resumed the polite distraction of other people's meals. Then the man's hand tightened where it rested. One movement. Eli saw the flash of it and stepped in. There was no theatrics. He didn't shout for cameras or tackle the man with a movie-style sweep. He set a tray down on the table with a precision that made noise, silverware clinking like the start of something. With one arm, he placed the tray between the man's chest and the woman's face, a small, immediate barrier. It was enough to jolt the man back, to provide a second to reframe the moment. "Sir, please," Eli said, voice low and steady. "You can't touch customers." The man swore under his breath. His pride and his inability to be refused flared. He pushed the tray. It rocked but didn't fall. A wine glass trembled, but nobody screamed. The man rose to his feet. His chair scraped. For a heartbeat, the whole restaurant inhaled. Eli moved with a kind of urgent slowness. One step to the man, a hand at the back of his jacket to anchor him, a firm, careful grip. meant not to hurt but to assert presence. He had rehearsed nothing. He simply did what his muscles had known from carrying trays: balance, leverage, and awareness of how weight can be redirected without breaking. "You need to go," he said, calm and unshakable, holding the man's eyes with no challenge, just the clear limit of a person doing his duty. Now. There was a push, quick and ugly, and then, because courage isn't a single thing but a crowd of small choices, the crowd made a small noise. Someone called a number. Another person stood up. The manager stepped out from the pass, a towel over his shoulder, and repeated the request formally. The man shoved at Eli. Not a cinematic brawl, but a clumsy, dangerous lunge. Eli had the presence to pivot and let the man's motion carry him past the table instead of toward the woman. The man tripped over his own shoe, hitting the edge of a booth, and cursed loudly before hurrying toward the door, hair wild and face red. No one followed. The door closed behind him with a definitive click that left the room both louder and emptier. The restaurant exhaled. The woman sat still, the trimmer in her hands visible as she set her tablet down. Her voice was measured when she finally spoke, not a plea but an assessment. "Thank you," she said. It was not theatrical gratitude, but a factual acknowledgement, like a check marked off. She wrapped her coat tighter around her, a gesture of reclaiming herself, and then stood. Eli offered her water, a small human thing. She accepted. Outside, the breeze was sharp and smelled faintly of rain. The city had that particular silence of late hours, fewer cabs, dimmer lights, the occasional shout in distance that sounded like someone else's crisis. She looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time the armor cracked. He noticed a faint line at the corner of her eye, an old grief, not fresh but present enough to make someone wary of unexpected kindness. "I'm Claire," she said, offering her name like a data point.
"I work downtown. Thank you, Eli." She had seen his name tag when he had leaned over to steady the tray. It was an odd intimacy, names in a city of strangers. He gave hers back in the same manner. "Eli," he said, "do you want me to call a cab?" Or, his instinct was to offer practical rescue, the kind he did for clients in parties every night. "No," she shook her head. Maybe I should go to the clinic anyway. I have some things I need checked." She didn't say the word hurt. She didn't have to. The effect of being touched without consent had a slow, corrosive echo. They decided, together and without much ceremony, to go to a nearby emergency clinic. The manager wrote down directions, and the busboy got them a bottle of water packed in a napkin. A coworker, May, slipped Eli an extra pen, a small sign of solidarity. Someone else pushed a few dollars into his apron. He accepted each kindness with his chin lowered, as if it was currency he didn't dare spend on dreams. At the clinic, the fluorescent lights cut through the night with their steady, indifferent glare. Clinic waiting rooms are strange places where people's private weather sits on shared chairs. The receptionist typed regularly, her face a practiced neutral. There were magazines folded into strips, and the quiet sigh ventilated air. They were placed in adjacent chairs, separate but close, like two islands that found themselves side by side. Claire sat still, her hands clasped. She answered questions with the clipped professionalism of someone who had given away pieces of herself in office meetings and negotiations, and had learned exactly how much to reveal. Her armor, once a shield against randomness, had started to show thin cracks where the world had been too heavy for it to remain whole. She told the triage nurse she felt shaken and that she'd been touched against her will. The nurse's face softened with the practiced sympathy of someone who had seen this before. Eli sat and watched. He fumbled in his apron pocket and found a hospital bracelet, his own, constricted from that afternoon's visit when he had taken Jonah for a routine infusion. The bracelet had been folded into his pocket for weeks. He sometimes took it out and rolled it between thumb and forefinger. Tonight he brought it to his lips without thinking, a small prayer for a small life that fit in his palm. The nurse took Claire's vitals and asked if she would like someone to stay with her while they made sure everything was okay. "If you want," the nurse said softly, "we can call someone. Or you can stay here. You're not alone." The idea of someone making the call, of another person holding the heavy practical things, was foreign to Claire. She had managed alone for years, but at that precise, fragile moment she nodded, and when the nurse glanced at Eli, he slipped quietly into the small service of attention, the odd role he had learned that didn't involve applause, being steady. They waited.
Waiting rooms make time feel granular, small periods strung out like beads. Conversation, when it came in halting, honest measures. Claire was the first to talk, her voice low. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "You could have walked away." "I couldn't," Eli said simply.
He thought of Jonah asleep with his small hand tucked under a blanket, the sound of his breathing on days when the wheeze came like a distant weather. My boy, he depends on me. He wasn't asking for sympathy. He didn't want to make her the audience to his life, but something made him pull the photo from his wallet and set it on his knee like a small offering. The photo was not staged, a child's grin with a missing front tooth, colored markers on the table behind him. He gets scared when I walk home late, Eli said, embarrassed by the obviousness of the sentence. So when I see someone else who might get hurt, I can't just let it happen. Claire studied the photo as if she were taking a legal deposition, but when she looked up, the edge of her face had softened. He's beautiful, she said. It was a small admission, a word that made space in the room. You work hard, she said then, looking at his hands, which still had the slight scar on the knuckle from a past kitchen mishap. You take care of people in your way. It matters. Claire's words weren't dramatic. They were practical, observant. They had the weight of someone who'd spent decades parsing details and discovering where things needed repair. Her voice carried a professional distance, yes, but it was threaded now with a human recognition. They spoke of small things after that, how the clinic smelled like something they both knew too well, the odd symmetries of being alone in public, the ways adults tried to pretend order. Claire told him, reluctantly, about why she sat alone. Her job demanded late hours and a careful temperament, and about a loss from years back that had taught her to keep people at a distance. Not a confessional, just a letting of air out of a held breath. She had learned, she said, that being seen is not always safe, so she dressed herself in privacy like armor. Eli listened, and for the first time he felt the familiar line between helper and friend blur. There was no romance in it. It was the human close-up that comes after danger. Two people who had been afraid in different ways, and who now, for a moment, had to breathe near one another. He told her a few more things, how the clinic bills could stack until he had to choose which envelope to open, how he hummed lullabies that he could no longer remember fully because the song had been played 1,000 times. He did not dramatize. He laid out the facts like a ledger. Claire surprised him. I can help with something practical, she said. Not money, that feels weird.
But there are programs through the hospital, patient liaisons who help families navigate billing, and a social worker who runs a fund for families with children who have long-term treatment. I volunteer with them sometimes. I can put you in touch if you like. Eli's mouth opened, closed. He thought of the pride that had kept him from asking for help before, the nights he'd swallowed his worry and gone back to work. If you could, that would help, he said, and the sentence contained an enormous relief, like air after being underwater. Okay, Claire said. I'll get you the contact. I'll ask the nurse to connect us. It felt like a small kindness, practical and precise, not something that would change the arc of destiny, but something that could ease the next month. She wrote on a paper pad, quiet notes with her exacting penmanship, and handed it to him. She refused his offer to be reimbursed or thanked with anything more than a sincere thank you. Outside the clinic windows, the city moved in oblivious loops. The man who had caused the commotion had already been absorbed into the night. There would be no grand reckoning or a court scene that rewrote his character. The consequences of his behavior registered in the restaurant's log and in the angry texts his sister later sent him. The manager filed a complaint and made a note to call the police if the man returned. Eli's job had been to keep a line where none had been before. He had done that and returned to his life. But the events didn't end in the sterile geometry of forms. There are afters that matter more than the incident itself. A conversation in a fluorescent room that lets someone understand they're not invisible. A note with contact details slid into a pocket. A manager shifting a schedule to honor the quiet heroism of a worker who had to be in two places at once. Word spread in the small ring of the restaurant. The manager left Eli a message that morning asking if he could take fewer double shifts for a while, that they'd rotate the floor so his off days were lined up with clinic appointments. May brought him an extra coffee with a smile that held new respect. A regular customer slipped an envelope onto the tip jar, small bills folded into a larger note with "For Jonah, stay strong" written on the outside. The acknowledgement was modest and private. Eli accepted it with a look that held gratitude and the hollow surprise of someone who had never expected to be seen. Claire sent an email to the hospital's social work department. A patient liaison called Eli 2 days later and arranged for someone to sit with him while he navigated the billing maze. It wasn't a miracle. It was a practical hand across a bureaucracy, an appointment put on the calendar, documents gathered so he wouldn't have to miss a shift converting hope into a schedule. The simple act saved him hours of frantic calls and a night's worry. In the weeks that followed, there were small shifts. The manager adjusted his schedule so Eli could take Jonah to a late afternoon appointment without having to close the restaurant, and sometimes coworkers covered the floor if he had to leave early. Claire, who had more than her fair share of cold mornings, began to look up from her tablet and ask the busboy's name. She was subtle about it, but she would offer a wave of recognition to the staff as she passed through the restaurant. Once, she left a note for Eli at the host stand. "Thank you. I hope your boy feels better soon." It was brief and precise, not the kind of thing that romance novels rely on, but in its brevity was the gift of being seen. Eli did not become a different person overnight. He still worked late shifts and tallied bills with a careful pen. He still folded his son's drawings into the inside flap of his wallet and took out the same hospital bracelet to smooth between thumb and finger in the waiting room. But there was a subtle internal change, the knowledge that someone outside his small circle recognized him for who he was. That kind of recognition is not wealth, but it is a kind of currency. It buys a little room to breathe. Claire's life shifted in small measures, too. Her days, usually governed by meetings and ledger lines of responsibility, found a little softness she hadn't authorized, a patience in the taxi driver who cut her off, a call to a friend she hadn't spoken to in months. She began to see how automatic her armor had become, not as protection, but as distance that she could choose to lower sometimes. She didn't suddenly become gentle with everyone, such things don't happen like light switches, but she let herself accept a cup of coffee from a barista and use his name with an honesty that was unfamiliar. When she had to testify at an internal meeting later about a different matter, she spoke with a new edge of warmth that surprised even her colleagues. There was a local blog that covered human interest pieces, and the manager, who had a way with small courtesies, sent a note describing the event and the way Eli had acted. The piece was brief and careful. It called him a quiet hero, a term that made a few people in the restaurant smile and raised neither flag nor fanfare. It made someone donate a small bag of groceries left anonymously on the back stoop, and a regular brought a casserole for Jonah when Eli had a particularly difficult week. One night, a neighbor knocked and offered to watch Jonah for a Saturday while Eli caught up on sleep. Each act considered alone was modest. Together, they became a network that made the edges of his life less sharp. Eli's son improved in small measures, the kind that medicine and time make, and there were days when the machines hummed differently. They celebrated the small victories with strawberry ice cream in a paper cup and a show with puppets at the clinic's family room. Jonah's drawings multiplied, the stick figures more confident, the sun completing its circle with thicker lines. Eli kept the drawings now in a box with neat edges, little icons of survival. For Claire, the act of being rescued by someone she'd barely noticed rearranged a few internal furniture pieces. She found herself calling in a favor to a hospital fund manager she knew professionally and asking for information. Purely professional, she told herself, practical ties that might be useful for someone else someday. She didn't offer money. She offered connection and time, and a presence that had been missing from her life. The ability to let someone in, the small way of sitting with them in a clinic while forms were filled out. The night that mattered had not been a singular dramatic pivot that turned their lives into a neat moral. It was a fracture that let light through, unexpected, clean, and realistic. The man who had caused the disturbance was a problem resolved by policy and presence. He might have spent a night thinking about what had happened and then returned to his pattern. That was not the point. The point was the ordinary courage that steps in, not for notoriety, but because the alternative is to live with the knowledge that you let harm pass. It was a plain decision to be the kind of person who notices and acts in tiny ways. Months later, there was another small, private scene. Eli came into the restaurant in the early evening, apron tied, the bell jangling with the familiar cadence of another night shift. Jonah was home that night with the babysitter who had become something of a guardian, a neighbor who watched cartoons and made sandwiches with more patience than a saint. Eli checked his watch, smoothed a napkin, and glanced at the shelf behind the host stand where a small folded note rested. It was from Claire. She would be stopping by the next week and had asked if she could bring 2 tickets to the Children's Museum. "For you and Jonah," it read. "No pressure. If you can't, I'll understand." He blinked. It wasn't charity. It wasn't a life-changing gift. It was someone extending a small foothold into the possibility of being seen in daylight as well as in the blur of midnight. He showed the note to May, who laughed softly and said, "See, you do have a fan club." But the final transformation was quieter than any external validation. One morning, as the city woke in a wash of pale light, Jonah toddled to the kitchen table with a drawing he had made for his dad. It was a stick figure with a tray and an apron, and above it a sun scribbled in frantic yellow. Underneath he had written in his toddling way, "My dad is a hero." He folded the paper slowly and put it in his wallet. He did not need headlines to be a hero. He did not want to be famous. He wanted, like anyone, to be known, and to know that his son could sleep without fear at night. Yet the shape of his life had shifted,
not because of a single brave move, but because courage had been noticed, and the noticing had been answered with real, practical kindnesses that made survival a little less precarious. Invisible heroism, then, is not always about the dramatic rescue. Sometimes it's a small decision to stand between someone and harm, to hold a moment so another person can reclaim their space. Sometimes it's the slow accrual of kindnesses that rearrange an ordinary life into something slightly more bearable. Eli returned to the restaurant week after week, balancing trays, carrying the private geography of his family's needs in the folds of his uniform. When customers told him he had a steady hand, he smiled and said nothing. When Jonah drew another sun with thicker rays, Eli tucked it in the photo frame on his small kitchen shelf and wondered, not for the first time, how many people held their worlds together without anyone knowing. Claire kept her boundaries. She made calls and set appointments, and showed up to the Children's Museum with a purchase ticket and a quiet smile. She started to look up from her tablet to greet the staff with the names she had learned. She learned that being seen did not always demand a cost from her soul. Sometimes it just required her willingness to cross a small threshold. There were no grand rewards, no cinematic ending where everything was fixed. There were side effects of goodness: a manager who swapped shifts, a neighbor who offered help without being asked, a social worker who untangled a bill, and a bag of groceries that arrived anonymously on a hard week. The rescue had immediate consequences: a shaken woman protected, a violent encounter ended, and longer, patient ones. Two people allowed themselves to let down defenses in separate, cautious ways that made daily life richer. What lingered most in the city was that somebody noticed. People who work late and carry burdens survive on a network of gestures much smaller than storybook heroics. A name remembered, a schedule adjusted, the patient who brings an extra cookie to the kitchen. These are the unflashy, necessary goods of life. Eli learned to accept them, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with gratitude so broad it left him vulnerable. The word hero settled into his life more by other people's mouths than his own. He found himself uncomfortable with the weight of the label and relieved by it at the same time. Being invisible had protected him for a long time. Being seen exposed him. The exposure was okay. It let Jonah hear his father being recognized not by applause, but by neighbors and nurses and diners who had been there that night, and remembered the calm hand that kept the chaos away. It let Claire find that danger had taught her something strangely valuable, that defense can live alongside compassion. Months merged into a new weave.
The restaurant became slightly more attentive to safety protocols. The manager instituted a brief staff refresher on de-escalation and how to support colleagues after incidents, framed not as an indictment, but as support for workers who carry other lives with them. Small, practical safety measures made the floor feel more human. Other coworkers, who had always been like a second family, rallied more often, covering shifts and checking in. At home, Eli counted fewer nights spent pacing through a worry so thick he could not sleep. The practical help from the liaison unknotted a few of the tightest knots. One evening, after a long day, Eli and Jonah stood at the window watching the city lights settle like a field of tiny watchful eyes. Jonah held a small crayon drawing with the letters wobbly across the bottom. Dad. Eli kissed the top of his son's head and thought about the night in the restaurant. He thought about the small things that had kept him afloat since then: the schedule swap, the casserole, the anonymous bag of groceries. He thought of Claire's steady, non-sentimental help. He thought about how two people whose lives had run parallel and separate suddenly touched at a fragile point and became, briefly, companions on a small road. For a while, they had both been armored in different metals, she in reserve, he in responsibility. The armor had changed shape. It did not fall away. At the restaurant months later, a tourist asked for a recommendation, and the host waved a hand at the staff. "They've got great servers," she said. "They look like they just love what they do." Eli heard it and felt something like the warmth of being recognized settle under his ribs. He kept moving, plates balanced, the routine a kind of prayer in motion. In the kitchen, May handed him a towel with a knowing smile. Outside, the city moved, indifferent and fierce. Inside, small acts of mutual attention made the world a little less sharp. If you ever find yourself thinking heroes must be crowned in billowing capes or lit by cameras, think again. Some heroes don't want an audience. They want a stable paycheck, a child to sleep through the night, a neighbor to hold a casserole when needed. The most remarkable acts are often quiet: a tray set down to shield, a firm voice to redirect, a hand handed out without flourish. If this story speaks to you, think of someone who quietly holds your world together, someone who moves without seeking attention and keeps lives steady in their small, everyday ways. Share their name below and give them the simple gift of being seen. Eli returned to shifts, to clean plates and late hours, but he did so with the lightness of someone who had been recalled into the human fold. Jonah colored new suns and added a cape to one of his stick figures, as if to remind his father that the small things matter.
Claire still kept her distances, but when she walked into the restaurant, she learned to say more than hello. She learned to remember names. In the end, Invisible Hero became less a title and more a recognition of a truth, that ordinary lives are stitched together by decisions, and sometimes the bravest choice is the one to step in and hold space for someone else. Eli didn't want a headline. He wanted, finally, the space to breathe and the knowledge that if danger came, someone would stand in the subtle light beside him. So if you feel moved, pass this story on. Tell someone, in a message or a shout, the name of an invisible hero in your life. Let them know they are seen. They are not alone.